And after this flood many years, as the chronic telleth, these two pillars were found, and as the Chronicon saith, that a great clerk that was called Pythagoras found that one, and Hermes the philosopher found that other, and they taught forth the sciences that they found therein within. Okay, the trouble is that Polychronicon C 1326 to 1342 doesn't say any such thing. That medieval text written by Ranulph Higden to summarize earlier works is silent on such matters, and merely repeats Josephus's remarks on the pillars of wisdom. That's why I was surprised to find the actual source, the medieval author Petrus Comester, or Peter the Eater, whose Hysteria Scholastica c. 1173 long served as the medieval popular Bible for its paraphrased and Vulgate, and supplemented it with what he knew of Greco-Roman literature. Petrus was also a named source used by Higden, suggesting that the Cook author either confused the two texts or else had a manuscript of Higden that had been supplemented with more of Petrus. Anyway, here is some of what Petrus says. 28. And because he, Tubal-Cain, had heard Adam prophesy of the two judgments, that the art he invented should not perish, he inscribed them on two columns, the whole of it on each. According to Josephus, one was of marble and the other of brick, so that one would not dissolve by the flood and the other would not be incinerated by the flames. Josephus says the marble one was yet in the land of Syria. Tubal-Cain, who was the first to invent the art of blacksmithing, delighted in the sounds of metal and invented musical tones, which discovery the Greeks attributed to Pythagoras, and that is Jason Calavito's translation. And there are parts missing. Like there's a part missing between the land of Syria, and it goes into Tubal-Cain, who was the first to invent the art of blacksmithing, and then a piece missing between that and delighted in the sounds of metal. Just to let everybody know. Okay, now I'll continue with the reading. There is a lot to unpack here, but let's start with the obvious. The author of the Cook manuscript has taken the part of Petrus's text where he essentially accuses the Greeks of lying about Pythagoras inventing music, and instead harmonizes the two accounts by making Pythagoras discover Tubal-Cain's lost writings. So much for Pythagoras' entry into the story, which comes almost certainly from Petrus using a line in Isidore of Seville's De Musica 16, where that author writes that Moses says that Tubal, who came from the lineage of Cain before the flood, was the inventor of the art of music. The Greeks, however, say that Pythagoras discovered the origins of this art from the sound of hammers and the tones made from hitting them. And that again is Jason Calavito's translations. However, Petrus Comester of Isidore have made an error deriving from the faulty Latin. The old Latin translation of Flavius Josephus from around 35 to 400 CE, the source that stands behind Petrus and probably Isidore, mistakenly gives Tubal instead of Jabal from Genesis 4:21 as the inventor of music, and later authors repeat the error. This error probably comes from misreading the Septuagint, where Tubal-Cain is shortened to just Tubal, making confusion easier. The Old Latin is also the source for the reference of latrice as the building material for one of the pillars. It is the Latin word for brick later, either untranslated or unrecognized by the Cook author. Petrus also follows the Old Latin misreading in some but not all manuscripts of Syriad Greek, an obsolete term for Egypt as the land of Cyrus, as Syria in Terra Syria. Thus, many of the peculiarities of the text can be attributed to the mistakes and word choices of the 4th century Latin translators of Josephus. By the 15th century, when the Cook manuscript was composed, there was a popular story attested in an anonymous music manual that Pythagoras, under the name Pictagoras, visited Tubal to learn about music before Tubal created 2 pillars containing the science of music to save the science from the flood. The jump from this story to the one given in Cook is a small one, requiring only the knowledge of Pythagoras. Only the knowledge the Pythagoras lived after the flood, and therefore must have gotten his knowledge from Tubal-Cain indirectly. The whole legend, in all its various forms, derives in a likelihood from Isidorus' brief observation that the Greeks and the Scriptures ascribed 2 different origins to music. To the medieval mind, such contradictions had to be reconciled, no matter how convoluted the results. The remaining question, for which I have no good answer, is how Petrus Comester came to ascribe the pillars of wisdom to Tubal-Cain of the sinful line of Cain, rather than to the godly sons of Seth, as Josephus gave it. One answer I've seen proposed is that Petrus was influenced by the contemporary chronicles of Jeremiah. The version extant in those days anyway. Our surviving text is later, where in chapter 4, in repeated verbatim in 26, the pillars of wisdom are attributed to Jubal, not Tubal, as a repository for music. 6. At this time the inhabitants of the earth began to commit violence, to defile each other, and kindle the anger of the Lord. They began to sing with the harp and to the reed pipe, and to sport with all kinds of songs, corrupting the earth. This Jubal discovered the science of music, whence arose all the tunes for the above 2 instruments. This art is very great. 7. And it came to pass, when he heard of the judgments which Adam prophesied concerning the 2 trials to come upon his descendants by the flood, the dispersion and fire, he wrote down the science of music upon 2 pillars, one of white marble and the other of brick, so that if one would melt and crumble away on account of water, the other would be saved. The translation was done by Moses Gaster. More likely, Petrus derived his claims from glosses on the Vulgate, the 11th century Glossa Ordinaria, or Genesis 4:21 reads, for example, Josephus writes that this Jubal wrote music on 2 columns, one of stone and the other of brick, that the first might survive a flood and the second flames, which were the 2 judgments Adam said would come. And that is Jason Colavito's translation. Josephus didn't say that, but for some reason medieval people seem to think he did. That finally is the biggest mystery. How did Josephus's accounts become corrupt to the point that Tubal-Cain ended up the creator of the pillars? Sacred geometry is the geometry used in the planning and construction of religious structures such as churches, temples, mosques, religious monuments, altars, tabernacles, as well as for sacred spaces such as temenoi, sacred groves, village greens, and holy wells, and the creation of religious art. In sacred geometry, symbolic and sacred meanings are ascribed to certain geometric shapes and certain geometric proportions. According to Paul Coulter, in the ancient world, certain numbers had symbolic meaning aside from their ordinary use for counting and calculating. Plane figures and polygons, triangles, squares, hexagons, and so forth were related to the numbers 3 in the triangle, for example, were thought of in a similar way and in fact carried even more emotional value than the numbers themselves because they were visual. Okay. The belief that God created the universe according to the geometric plan has ancient origins. Plutarch attributed the belief to Plutarch, writing, Plutarch said, God geometrizes continually. Convivialium disputationum liber 8:2. In modern times, the mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss adopted this quote, saying, God arithmetizes. At least as late as Johannes Kepler, between 1571 and 1630,